Volunteers. They're the lifeblood of many nonprofit organizations. But how we recruit, how we retain, how we manage, and how we empower and engage volunteers, that requires a whole lot of thoughtful effort and strategy. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about everything you need to know when it comes to engaging nonprofit volunteers. This lesson continues our discussion on volunteers as a stakeholder group. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the power of the nonprofit volunteer and how we can design volunteer programs. You'll also understand that critical relationship between volunteers and paid staff and be able to categorize volunteers. We'll also discuss the volunteer engagement cycle and things that cause volunteers to exit. And you'll also know how we can apply those same theories of motivation that we've already discussed, specifically in the volunteer context. First, let's talk about what volunteer programs are, including how they're implemented and how we go about engaging volunteers. First, let's understand a little bit about volunteers and the role that they play within nonprofit organizations. It might surprise you, but nearly 1/4 of the adult American population volunteers for nonprofit organizations each year. Because of this, and because of the number of volunteers, nonprofits have to be strategic and organized in how they approach the deployment of volunteers in their agencies. So many nonprofits, especially the larger ones, have formal volunteer programs. This is a very organized, structured initiative that aims to recruit, supervise, and engage those volunteers, make sure that their valuable time and efforts are used wisely and efficiently. Nonprofits that have effective volunteer programs and have put that forethought into the design and implementation of them result in volunteers who are engaged. So volunteer engagement is an organizational strategy beyond just designing of programs, but this is about encouraging that collaboration between the paid staff and the unpaid volunteer labor and making sure that there are meaningful volunteer opportunities that aren't just about putting people in slots to fill positions, but rather it's about positively impacting the mission. And I do want to note here that remember from previous lessons that there are vast differences in nonprofit size. Small nonprofits are classified as those that have 5 or fewer paid employees, and the large ones have nearly 400. So when you're looking at those larger nonprofit organizations that have much more people resources, they typically are going to have 1 or more paid staff positions dedicated solely to the job of managing volunteer programs and engaging volunteers. Now, just like we discussed with paid staff positions, you have to make sure that you've got people grouped in the right ways and you've got people in the right positions and the right roles, and you have solid hierarchy of authority and organizational design. The same thing applies to volunteers. So putting all of the things that you learned about organizational design into practice applies here as well, not just for paid staff. And just like we design jobs for paid staff positions, it's really important that nonprofits also engage in job design for volunteers. Now, recall from a prior lesson, we talked about the fact that an effective job description is based on effective job analysis and job design. So first, you need to assess what the needs are for the organization. Why do you have a need for this particular volunteer position? Then you analyze that job and look at the skills and the talents that are needed and the experience and the background, and you identify the functions that this position will fulfill. And only then do you describe the job with a job description. And with this, you're formalizing all of the things you did with your design and your analysis of the job, and you're articulating it so you can put it forth to recruit volunteers that are interested in the role. A good job description for volunteers will include all of the facets of the job design, but also it will articulate the nonprofit's mission, the role of the volunteer position and the responsibilities, being honest about the time commitment and not shortchanging it if it's a labor-intensive volunteer role, making it clear the qualifications and skills needed for someone to successfully fill this position. Also, it's important that you identify the benefits that the volunteer will get out of it, since this is an unpaid position, and the impact that they will make on the organization and its mission if they fill this position. And then finally, don't forget to include application information. If someone is interested in filling this volunteer role, how do they express that interest and apply, so to speak, for the position? And what you see here is a sample volunteer job description that includes all of these elements: the title of the job, mission, role, responsibilities, so on and so forth. And it is important for nonprofits to establish job design and to give job titles to volunteer positions, because if you just have general volunteers, people are running around not knowing what they're doing. And from a management perspective, it's going to be like herding cats. Not exactly easy. Now, as I mentioned, just like we design jobs and we design organizations when it comes to paid staff positions, It's important that we structure this for volunteers as well. And this includes developing and designing an organizational chart, which requires that you determine your hierarchy of authority. And remember, in an organization that refers to how we group people, who reports to whom, how we delegate roles, authority, decision-making responsibility, and things like that. So a hierarchy empowers volunteers by defining their authority. There's no ambiguity. They're crystal clear on the extent of their decision making. They know which volunteer reports to other volunteers. Because if you have a lot of volunteers and a more sophisticated volunteer program, you're going to need volunteer leaders. So establishing a hierarchy of authority puts that to paper and makes it very clear and helps mitigate confusion and misunderstandings. Now, just like we discussed, communication flows between and among volunteers as well. Volunteer communication can be upward, where it's someone that's lower on the hierarchy of authority communicating with someone above them on the hierarchy, downward, which is the opposite, lateral, which is equal, and diagonal, which is neither upward, downward, nor horizontal. Now, you need to understand in nonprofits, obviously volunteers, we need to focus on communicating with them as well. We need to make sure we have a practice of reaching out to volunteers. We're educating them on our programs, our services, our events, our missions. We're training and onboarding them into their volunteer positions, and that we're keeping them apprised of important developments in the organization. So really putting some thought into determining the who, what, when, where, how, and why that we communicate with volunteers is also part of an effective volunteer program. Now let's talk about that really important role of that volunteer staff partnership. And in particular, the relationship that a nonprofit executive director has with his or her board president. Now remember, one of the biggest distinctions between a nonprofit organization and a for-profit organization is the fact that nonprofits have the benefit of being able to rely on unpaid volunteer labor, whereas for-profit companies, they can't do that. So that's a notable distinction. And because of this, it's really important that those unpaid volunteers know their role, that they are able to be engaged and empowered. And the way they do that is by partnering with the people in that nonprofit agency who are there in paid staff positions. So the volunteer staff partnership refers to that collaboration, that relationship between the volunteers and the paid staff. It's all about working together, being harmonious, that you're working toward shared goals, that you're executing on the strategic plan, that everything you do is mission focused, and that you're really taking advantage of all of the unique talents, skills, and experiences that both volunteers and staff have to contribute to that organization. Now, sometimes tensions can arise in the volunteer staff partnership because sometimes volunteers don't understand their role. They don't understand their level of authority. And that's why job design and putting together an org chart and establishing that hierarchy is of utmost importance. And sometimes volunteers can kind of overstep their bounds. And likewise, sometimes nonprofit staff, they fail to give volunteers the adequate respect or to respect their expertise and to give them enough autonomy to engage in impactful work. So at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is to have a balanced partnership where it's not staff supervising volunteers, nor is it volunteers lording over staff and trying to assert authority and act like managers, but rather it's that lateral balanced partnership where, relatively speaking, there's equal exchange of resources, ideas, authority, decision-making power, and all of these things when it comes to both staff and volunteers. Just like nonprofits need to have a donor database to keep track of all of their donor relationships and moves management, and that's what we call when you're moving toward asking someone for a donation, we need to look at volunteers from the same aspect. We need to manage those data and use digital tools and software to have effective volunteer programs. And this is generally done through a VMP, or a volunteer management platform. This is simply a digital tool or software specifically designed to streamline that process of recruiting and onboarding and training volunteers, coordinating volunteers, communicating with volunteers, keeping all of their addresses, phone numbers, emails up to date, and all of those types of things. So a VMP generally serves as that centralized hub for all of the aspects of volunteer engagement. So it's all of the information about your volunteers, who's in what position, how many hours have they volunteered over whatever time period, and everything else related to the things that the volunteers do. And by ensuring that all that stuff is organized, staff can then focus more on the relationship aspect of ensuring they have that strong, effective, mutually respectful volunteer staff partnership instead of running around and trying to chase down email addresses. Now, when it comes to that volunteer staff partnership, There are some key factors that can drive strong relationships. And I will tell you, in all honesty, one of the hardest parts of working in a nonprofit is having to interact with volunteers. It's one of the most fulfilling aspects, but it's very challenging as well. And if you talk to anyone who's ever worked in a nonprofit, I promise you they will have a number of horror stories of volunteers gone wild that overstep their bounds, that are mean, that are difficult to work with, feel like they have this ultimate authority over staff. So these relationships can be difficult to manage. But if nonprofit employees put together some concerted effort toward engaging strong relationships, they can do that through things like this. One of the most important aspects of a volunteer staff relationship is clear communication. Volunteers get frustrated when they're in a role and they don't know what the heck they're doing, or they don't know what's expected of them, or they don't know what's going on in the organization, because other constituents and stakeholders look at your volunteers as being more in the know about your organization. And if they get asked a question and they don't know the answer because they don't know what's going on in that nonprofit agency, they tend to get really frustrated, and understandably so. Now, that communication, that needs to be reciprocal. Volunteers can't be out running the show, doing what they want, not reporting back to staff. There needs to be communication that goes both ways. An important one is shared goals and mission focus. You've heard repeatedly the importance of mission when it comes to nonprofit leadership. And this is critical. So everything that volunteers and staff are doing needs to be related to that mission. And then under that mission is that strategic plan, which identifies those goals of the organization. So staff and volunteers, they've got to be on the same page, and they have to share that unwavering commitment to that mission. Respect and recognition. Sometimes nonprofit staff can take their volunteers for granted. I've seen it. I've been guilty of it. But it's something that you need to be careful not to do. And part of this is making sure that you're always respecting your volunteers, even when they're kind of a pain in the butt. If you're busy, you've got a lot to do, you've got to volunteer. Oh, I've got this idea, that idea, and you don't have time for it. But you need to make sure you're always demonstrating respect, and that you're acknowledging their efforts, and that you're thanking them. Volunteers sometimes don't get the recognition that they deserve, especially those that have been dedicated and involved for many, many years, because sometimes the staff do kind of take them for granted. And this one is critical, making sure that you've defined the roles and expectations. We already talked about the importance of effective job design and job analysis when it comes to volunteer positions. We talked about the importance of establishing an organizational chart and a hierarchy of authority for your volunteers. But you can never stop reiterating the roles and who does what and who has what authority and who's responsible for what. Because if you're not defining the roles and expectations, there can be a lot of sometimes power struggles, miscommunication, misunderstanding, and that's when that partnership goes sideways. And then finally, collaboration and inclusion. And this kind of ties into the whole respect thing. Volunteers volunteer because they want to make an impact. They don't want to just sit around twiddling their thumbs or being a warm body filling some random volunteer position. So it's important for staff to actively seek input from volunteers and don't make decisions unilaterally like an autocratic leader, but instead use a democratic approach where they're collaborating with their volunteers and it's a shared authority and a shared decision-making effort. Now, arguably, the most critical volunteer staff partnership of any nonprofit agency is the executive director's relationship with his or her board president. And this stands to reason because these are your two key leaders. These are your executive leadership of the whole nonprofit agency. You've got your most important, highest ranking staff position and your most important, highest ranking volunteer leadership position. And they have this interesting relationship and dynamic. They're providing overall leadership together as co-leaders for the organization. Now, this partnership can get really complicated, and there can be conflicts with power dynamics because if it's a governing board, remember from our previous lesson that the board of directors directly supervises and oversees the executive director. So there are sometimes power dynamics, there are different personalities. Executive directors have the challenge of, because of term limits, which we discussed previously, they can have a beautiful relationship with a wonderful board president, but that board president hits their term limit and they're gone. And now it's someone new and they have to build trust and they have to get that knowledge and that history and build that relationship with somebody entirely new. There can be communication challenges. There's just so many things that you have to manage with this relationship that it can become difficult. Probably the biggest issue that contributes to things falling apart sometimes with this important executive director board president partnership is role ambiguity. As we've discussed, it's absolutely critical that you define clearly and you communicate the roles and responsibilities of the staff and the volunteers, and that everyone understands who has authority, who's doing what, who's responsible for what, who reports to whom. And this is especially important with this partnership. Role ambiguity happens when various parties have different ideas about who does what. And this can lead to a lot of friction and breakdown of that partnership. So being mindful of defining these roles is one of the keys of a successful ED board president relationship. Now let's talk about different categories of volunteers, because this will help when it comes to organizational design and how we group volunteers. And let's also talk about the factors that motivate volunteers. First, let's talk about what motivates and drives people to give back in the volunteer capacity. There's a term that we use commonly in the nonprofit sector that says head, heart, and halo to briefly and cutely describe why people volunteer. So it's a concept that basically describes three central motivations that push people to support nonprofits. There's the head motivation, and these are the logical reasons. So it might be networking opportunities. It might be this is going to look good on my resume. It might be I want to work at this nonprofit one day and volunteering will get me in the door. And it might be facts about the organization that person just appreciates from a logical perspective. It can also be heart motivation, and this is the emotional reasons that people support an organization. I personally am a cancer survivor, and because of that, I am on the board of Cancer Support Community, which is a cause that is personally important to me because that is a disease that has impacted me. So oftentimes people who volunteer for voluntary health organizations like American Heart Association, Cancer Support Community, American Diabetes Association, it's because they have some connection with that cause from a personal level, either themselves, a family member, a child, someone they love. And finally, halo motivation. This refers to the social and reputational benefits that someone gets out of supporting a cause. Now, of course, we want everyone to just be philanthropic and to volunteer and give back because it's the right thing to do. But you can't overlook this and how important it is, because some people do this because they do want to be perceived as caring. I mean, who doesn't? Everyone wants people to respect us and think, oh, she's a caring person, or oh, he gives back to the community, or oh, he's a good person. So that halo motivation, or trying to be like an angel, sometimes is a driving force behind volunteerism. Now that you know that head, heart, halo motivates people, let's talk about the attributes of a good volunteer. And we're going to use this with 3 Ds instead of 3 H's. And these 3 Ds are doers, donors, and door openers. When you look at the ideal volunteer of someone that you really want to get involved for your nonprofit agency, they're going to contain 1, 2, or ideally 3 attributes. One is that they're a doer. They're your worker bees. They have the time, they have the capacity to provide that hands-on labor. It can be stuffing envelopes to send out donor letters or an event invitation. It can be picking up the phone and thanking donors. It can be helping plan an event. It can be serving the community through whatever it is that your cause does. But these are the people that are giving that hands-on labor. They're physically there. They're doing the work. Donors are the financial contributors. Our door openers are people that may or may not have that personal giving capacity, but they're willing to leverage their network and proverbially open doors for the nonprofit. These are usually really networked people, the people that know other successful people, donors, community leaders, corporate sponsors, and they're willing to utilize their personal and professional networks to open doors, to solicit support from other people and organizations. Now, in a perfect world, we love volunteers that do all 3. They're your worker bees, and they're always there to do whatever hands-on stuff you need them to do, while simultaneously opening up their pocketbook and contributing financially, while simultaneously picking up the phone and calling their friends and their network, asking them to support the cause along with them as well. So when you start going through the process of volunteer recruitment, it's important to consider these things, especially when you're recruiting for volunteer positions that are a leadership role, especially your board of director positions. Now, another terminology that some agencies use are the 3 T's framework, and that is time, talent, and treasure. But I like the 3 Ds a little bit better, so we're going to rock with that. So when you're recruiting volunteers, we're going to seek out people who kind of fit that little ideal volunteer. They hit that intersection of that Venn diagram. Some people will be doers and donors. Some people will be donors and door openers, but not do the work. Some people will be doers and door openers, but they don't have a big bank account, so they don't donate as much. Some people will be just one of the 3, but the ideal volunteer is all three. So volunteers, they're critical. They're the lifeblood. They're the people doing the work, donating the money, giving their time, opening doors, doing all of these things. So how do we engage these volunteers and prevent them from leaving the organization? So we know what the ideal volunteer looks like. They're preferably all three of those three Ds. They're doers, they're donors, and they're door openers. But there's a process that we have to go about of finding those people and retaining those people. And this is where the volunteer engagement cycle comes into play. This refers to the stages through which someone progresses when they volunteer for an organization and remain involved. The first step is recruitment. Now, a lot of times recruitment happens organically, word of mouth or volunteers recruiting their friends to come along with them and get involved. But a lot of nonprofits engage in formal recruitment process. This involves posting that job description, even on places like LinkedIn, just like they would a paid staff position, and then vetting candidates. You don't want just any old warm body off the street who says, I've got time to give, but you want to make sure it's the right person that's a right fit for the right role. So you're going to interview them, vet them, make sure they have the credentials they say that they have, make sure that they have a passion for the mission. Once you've done your recruitment, it's time to place those volunteers. Nonprofits that have more sophisticated volunteer programs, they have a formalized volunteer orientation. This is where they sit down, usually with a group of volunteers, but sometimes it can be one-on-one, ensuring that volunteer really understands the mission, the vision, the goals, the values, the principles, that they see the strategic plan, they go through the strategic plan, they see the organizational chart, they discuss the hierarchy of authority, who reports to whom, they meet their staff partner, and they understand what their responsibilities and authority is relative to the staff partner's responsibility and authority. And they provide training specific to that volunteer position. So you give that volunteer all the tools they need to succeed. And then supervision. Yes, that volunteer staff partnership is about being as equitable as possible, of being that balanced partnership. But realistically speaking, at the end of the day, it is the nonprofit paid staff who have the ultimate responsibility for carrying out their job functions. Volunteers, they can come and go and they can flake out. They can not show up one day. It's very different than the expectations of a staff member. So when it comes to managing volunteers in a nonprofit organization, it is up to the designated staff to provide that guidance and support to their volunteer partners. And then recognition, making sure that we're treating our volunteers just like we would donors, where we're thanking them for their support. We're expressing that verbally. We're writing them handwritten thank you notes. We're sending them an email of appreciation. We do award ceremonies and we come up with award recognition programs for our top, most involved, most dedicated, most impactful volunteers. And the volunteer engagement cycle, it never stops. It's a constant evolving thing because unfortunately, there is the factor we have to deal with, which is volunteer turnover. Now, sometimes it's just because a volunteer, maybe they had a baby, they got a promotion at work, they moved, something has come up in life, they're burned out, they just can no longer be involved as a volunteer. That's what we call volunteer turnover. It's the rate of which volunteers discontinue being involved with a nonprofit organization. And when we have volunteers turning over, that creates vacancies where we have to undergo this volunteer engagement cycle all over again. We recruit, we place, we supervise, we recognize. We recruit, we place, we supervise, we recognize. It's a never-ending, constant cycle. While volunteer turnover sometimes is due to factors beyond the control of the paid staff in a nonprofit organization, there are some things that staff can do to try to mitigate volunteer turnover. As we've discussed, volunteers, they turn or cycle out of nonprofits for a bunch of different reasons. And one of those is burnout. Just like the paid staff can get burned out, especially in agencies that have high emotional labor because you're dealing with really heavy causes, volunteers can be impacted by that just as well. On average, volunteers, they spend 50 hours per year. That's a lot donating their time to nonprofits. And those really rock star volunteers, we have a bad tendency in nonprofits sometimes because we're busy and we're just so excited to have help and reliable help that we often lean on these rock star volunteers time and time again. And that can lead to a lot of time and they're at greater risk of experiencing burnout. So it's really important for nonprofit leaders to implement strategies, the same stuff we talked about in the previous lesson when it comes to staff, but we can apply these to volunteers as well. These are things like job rotation. Don't just put a volunteer in a really boring, monotonous position. I'm going to have you sit down and stuff envelopes all day. There are donor thank you letters. That gets really boring. That person's not going to feel like they're making use of their time. So you can use job enlargement, give them more tasks so they feel more impactful. You can implement job rotation, give them a different task, let them specialize in something else, and of course, providing recognition. Now, not all volunteer exits are voluntary. There is this kind of common joke in nonprofits that of all things nonprofit related probably drives me the most crazy, which is this mentality of, well, I'm a volunteer. What are you going to do? Fire me? Or, well, you can't fire a volunteer. And this is always said jokingly, but that is just absolutely not true. And the reason this drives me crazy is because this whole mindset that people do truly believe, some people, is that it can be really dangerous. Because while volunteers are unpaid positions, their participation is still not a right, it's a privilege. And removing a volunteer can sometimes become necessary for the health of an organization and its culture. So you can fire a volunteer. And in some cases, I would argue that it's critical to fire toxic volunteers because if not, you're doing a disservice to your organization and everyone else in it, including that person's fellow volunteers and the staff positions that are forced oftentimes to work with this toxic person. That being said, nonprofit leaders shouldn't be going out willy-nilly in a dictatorial way. You're fired, you're fired, you're fired, firing all these volunteers. I don't like the way you looked at me, you're fired. It's not about that. But instead, leaders need to have action plans in place that identify situations that warrant removal. And just like we manage paid staff, we can manage volunteers in the same way. If you have a volunteer that's not acting right, that's doing the wrong things, there's absolutely nothing wrong with obviously sitting down and having a conversation with them, which you absolutely should, but putting forth a written performance improvement plan, just like you would with the paid staff position that's failing at their job. And you say, here's how we want you to change your behavior. Here are the things that you need to do in order to stay a part of this organization. And making sure that you're always openly and honestly communicating, even when it's awkward. And trust me, these conversations are always awkward to prevent misunderstandings. Relative to setting expectations for volunteer behaviors, expectations, and performance, one way nonprofits can make sure those things are aligned is through the use of volunteer contracts. Volunteer contracts are sometimes called volunteer agreements because these are not legal binding. So some agencies prefer agreements because it's not a binding contract. But these are formal written agreements between a nonprofit and its volunteers. And I love volunteer contracts or volunteer agreements because it helps prevent a lot of misunderstanding. You're putting to paper exactly what the role, the terms, the expectations, and commitments are, not just for the volunteer, but also for their staff partner and the nonprofit as well. So this is a critical part of any type of volunteer management program. It's critical to have engaged volunteers who feel fulfilled, who feel like they're getting something out of their time that they're volunteering, and they're really motivated. A volunteer agreement is typically going to specify things that we put in a job description. This is why job descriptions are important for volunteers too. Here are the roles and responsibilities, the expected time commitment, but also the code of conduct. So if you have those formalized ethical frameworks that we discussed in a previous lesson, make sure that volunteer reviews them. They know you have them. They are signing a code of ethics. You're talking about your values and your principles and making sure that volunteer is in alignment with those and they're willing to behave in ways in accordance with those values and those principles. So by doing this, this helps really avoid a lot of those miscommunications and those misunderstandings. You're ensuring that everyone has a picture, perfect, clear understanding of their respective roles and responsibilities and obligations. Just like we have to focus on using theories of motivation to apply to paid staff, we also have to do it with our unpaid volunteer base as well. Now, if these theories look familiar, they should. These are the exact same theories that we discussed in our discussion around staff and how we motivate staff. Because even though volunteers are unpaid, a lot of the same stuff applies. This includes concepts that we've learned from equity theory. And remember, as a refresher, equity theory is where people in an organization are subconsciously sometimes assessing their inputs, all the things they're contributing to the organization, their time, their talent, their ability, things like that, relative to the outputs or the outcomes, the things they're getting out of the organization. For a paid staff member, that's going to be pay and bonus and health insurance and things like that. For a volunteer, however, those outcomes or outputs are different. That's going to be a sense of fulfillment, a resume booster, networking opportunities, feeling good about myself, feeling like I'm a good person. And as long as those inputs and outputs are equitable and that scale is balanced, everything's great. But if that scale gets out of whack, equity theory tells us people are going to start to lose motivation. So it's up to leaders to make sure that scale is always in balance for each member of the organization, be it a staff position or a volunteer. Additionally, expectancy theory tells us, well, there's a whole lot of factors that go into motivation, but the key takeaway with this as it applies to volunteers is that self-efficacy, that volunteers have to feel confident in themselves. And they have to feel confident that if they put forth the time and they put in the effort, they will be successful. And that success will translate into outcomes they value. And for volunteers, those outcomes are not going to be a paycheck or a pay raise or a pay bonus, but instead it's going to be the outcome that they feel like they're moving the needle. They're pushing that mission forward. And then finally, goal setting theory, remember, tells us that if we set specific and challenging goals, that can increase motivation. So remember, our goals that we set for volunteers, just like we do for the organization as a whole, and just like we do for paid staff, they need to be SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, but they also need to be difficult, yet achievable. Don't forget that A part of SMART. So as you can see, engaging volunteers in an impactful way, it's not just about bringing in any warm body off the street to check a box and say, well, here's a volunteer. Instead, it requires a lot of dedicated strategy, effort, and leadership to ensure that we're recruiting the right people, putting them in the right positions, and we're leading them in the right ways to empower them so they feel fulfilled and retain in the organization because they know that they're truly making a difference and moving that organizational mission forward.